Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. We're so excited to have you for our July 2026 webinar, Meet the Pollinators You've Been Swatting Away. Thanks again for being here. My name is Anna Gray Anderson, and I am the Community Engagement Manager for People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN for short. For those of you who aren't familiar with our webinar series, we usually host a monthly event, so be sure to sign up for our calendar and check that out and sign up for our e-news to keep up to date with all of our upcoming events. And we can put this link in the chat for you. And before we get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about us. Okay. Like I said, we are People and Pollinators Action Network, or PPAN, the host of this webinar. We focus a lot on making Colorado a safe haven for all who live here, from people to pollinators. And we do this through grassroots advocacy, education and outreach, kind of like this webinar, policy work, community mobilization, and habitat creation. A good example of this work is our Habitat Fund grants program, which is based on the sales of the pollinator license plate and goes towards creating pollinator safe spaces while promoting community mobilization. And I did just want to emphasize the significance of the Protect Pollinators license plate, if my screen will work and load. But PPAN championed the legislation that created this license plate, and the majority of the donations for the plate go directly to funding the Habitat Fund Small Grants Program. And since 2023, we've been able to support about 96 projects that has resulted in the creation of over 65 acres of pollinator safe habitat. So by getting a plate, you'll be contributing directly to getting more native plants in the ground, which leads to more pollinators. And we can also put this link in the chat for you all. Okay, so we're super excited and grateful to have the Senior Director of Horticulture at the amazing Butterfly Pavilion, Amy Yarger, with us today. Amy has been with Butterfly Pavilion since May of 2000, and she currently leads Butterfly Pavilion's local pollinator habitat initiatives, such as the Baseline Pollinator District and the Urban Prairies Project, which restores habitat in urban and suburban green spaces in Westminster and Broomfield. Amy has also installed pollinator habitat gardens throughout the community at locations such as Sprout City Farms, Clear Creek Valley Park, and the Good Samaritan Hospital. Her articles have been published in Colorado Gardener, Aqualigia, and the Journal for the Association of Zoological Horticulture. And through habitat gardening and education, Amy hopes to create a closer connection to nature and a greater understanding about the need for biodiversity locally and globally.
All right.
Oh, sorry.
Oh.
My screen is screening. Okay. Sorry, one more thing before we get started. And as a reminder, please just stay muted, leave your questions in the chat, and we will get to them at the end of the presentation, time permitting. We're also recording this presentation and we'll post it to our YouTube channel soon. And everyone who registered will get an email with that recording, presenter slide, and other relevant links. And then we also encourage you to make a donation today so that PPAN can continue to host this free webinar series and to support PPAN's education, advocacy, and habitat creation efforts. A donation of any size really does make a difference, so thank you for your consideration. And another way to support this work is by getting that beautiful pollinator license plate. And again, we'll put all these links in the chat to make it easy. And with that, I will pass it off to Amy. I'll stop sharing. And thank you so much.
All right. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Anna Gray, and thank you, everybody, for being here. I can't tell you how long I've been looking forward to talking about this topic. I've definitely sensed somewhat of a sea change, and we'll talk about that. I think there's a little bit more um, willingness to talk about some of these creatures that maybe people perceive as negative, pests, annoying, disgusting. Um, but of course, that's what we're in the business of at Butterfly Pavilion. So Butterfly Pavilion is an AZA accredited invertebrate zoo. And so of course we're covering all the species of animals without backbones, and that makes up about 97% of animal species. And those are precisely the animals that for as long as I can remember, people try to get rid of in a variety of alarming ways in many cases. And yet they are so important to our continued thriving on this planet. And we are seeing declines here in Colorado and around the world. And so the time is now if we're going to take action to make sure that these important invertebrates are here to help us out. Um, Invertebrates, of course, I love them because they're cool and they come in every shape, every, size, mostly small, but they do amazing things. Their life cycles are inherently just fascinating. But if you have to make the case to other people, I think making the case that many of these animals are directly involved with these ecosystem services. And by that, I mean what nature provides for our livelihoods, our health, our continued existence. So everything from natural materials that we need, the pollination for crops that we need, all the way into making sure that we have clean water and pest management services. So invertebrates do a lot of this work. They often don't get recognized for it, but that's part of what my job is to talk to people about recognizing the incredible invertebrate biodiversity that exists all around us all the time. And yet they're everywhere and they're so important, and yet they're very understudied. And so something that we're trying to address with our partners across the state and across the world is you know, invertebrates make up such a huge proportion of living species, and yet only about 2% of the research focuses on these animals. There's so much we still yet don't know, and how can we conserve them if there's such a gap in understanding? And that definitely applies to our friends, the flies, that we will talk about. And so we've heard these reports from papers published in the last several years that we are seeing declines in populations of terrestrial invertebrates. And one thing I want to recognize is that, Colorado is taking steps to have a better understanding. This Colorado Native Pollinating Insects Health Study made huge advances in understanding on public lands, like what is needed to understand more about these native pollinators. And even in just the history, since I've been at Butterfly Pavilion, I've been there since May 2000. And when I started, everyone would say, well, how do you attract butterflies to your garden and not bees, right? So even then, the circle of care or the circle of interest was very, very narrow when we talked about pollinators. People were concerned about getting stung, and so they would just ask me how just butterflies seemed harmless and they're beautiful. So let's just focus on them. And just in the last, especially 10 to 15 years, I'm seeing more and more concern. First, it was butterflies and maybe honeybees, right? Like people like, well, honeybees are important, right? They understood that connection with our food systems. And then now meet people every day who are like, native bees are cool. They're, interesting to look at. They have interesting life histories. They're so important. And I'm hearing that more and more, but we still have a ways to go. There are so many cool pollinators here in Colorado and around the world that are not often lumped in when you buy that cool pollinator merch. It's pretty infrequent that you get a wasp on there, right? And yet wasps are also important pollinators, moths, beetles. These are the pollinators that I call unsung pollinators because they are so important and yet they just don't get the same amount of love. And flies absolutely fall into that category. So before getting like launching in about why you should love these pollinators, I'm going to just give a little bit of an overview about who are these order Diptera, these flies. The word Diptera, which is the name of the order of flies, just means two-wing. And we'll talk about why that's important in a moment. So if I were to come to you and say, like, I really want a fly garden, I think, that would be so cool to plant habitat for flies. This might be what you imagine. So in many general kind of like public education type of materials, they'll talk about flies are attracted to stinky flowers, dull flowers. And that doesn't sound like a great basis for a garden, right? You're like, well, why would I want a garden full of dull, stinky flowers? And of course, some of the biggest examples are corpse flowers. So this is a Rafflesia, which is a parasitic plant. It is pollinated by flies in Asia, right? It's a great plant. I think it's fascinating. It does smell like rotting meat. And what happens is these blowflies come because they think they'll lay their eggs in there because that's what they do with rotting meat is they lay their eggs and then they get trapped in there a little bit and they pollinate and that's what allows the plant to reproduce. That is not the only type of plant flies pollinate. And as we'll learn, flies go to a lot of different kinds of plants, and some of them are not stinky at all, and they don't look like rotting meat even. So that's just one stereotype that you can have a perfectly lovely fly garden, and we'll talk about that, about how you might go about doing that towards the end. So if you're looking at a fly, some things that distinguish it from other kinds of insects is instead of having two pairs of wings like bees and butterflies and beetles do, they have one pair of wings. And that is probably even when a fly looks like something else, if you look closer, you'll be able to say like, oh, there's only two wings there, Diptera. That's how you can tell the difference. They often also many of them have these like very small spongy tongues, which limits the kinds of flowers that they can visit. They don't have these long proboscis or really hefty tongues like some of our other pollinators do. Flies, they're also very well known for the size of their eyes, right? They usually have very large eyes. They have great eyesight, so they're really good at finding resources, seeing each other, seeing potential predators. They really rely very heavily on their eyes. And then because of the way that they're built and and all the things about their anatomy, they are really good at flying. They have some pretty impressive flight maneuvers. They can fly very quickly. They're just really good at getting around. And I just want to point out, even though they only have one pair of wings, what they do have behind that one pair of wings are these very reduced little buds called halteres. And so you'll see that one pair of wings and then you'll see these little buds where you see that yellow arrow. Those are like evolutionarily like reduced wings, and those actually help them with maneuvering. That's part of why they are so good at maneuvering around, is they have these, it's almost like little handlebars in a way, a good way to think about it. And then, so a little bit about how they're built. Their life cycles, just like other insects with complete metamorphosis, they do go through the egg, larva, pupa, adult phase. Um, I think it can be hard to get people to love the larva as much as the adults. Even caterpillars don't get as much love as adult butterflies, but it's really important that we have space for these babies, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the habitat portion. But I just want to note that these larvae have different ways of living depending on what kind of fly it is. You can see that caterpillar that has those little tic-tac looking things on its back, those are eggs. And so many of our flies are parasitoids on other insects. They will lay their eggs in other insects. Those eggs will then eat the prey, and then
Okay.
emerge as adults. Um,
Okay.
some other maggots are predators, and so the one that you see on the right, you can actually see those big jaws, right? Like they are actually really great, and that has implications for us keeping pests under control. And we'll talk about that. So even if it's a hard sell to say like maggots, you should have more of them. There are absolutely some baby flies that if calling them baby flies helps you love them a little bit more, then we should call them baby flies, because they will help you in your garden. So what I'm going to do is kind of focus on a few different ways, several different ways that flies are really, really beneficial for us and also just overall cool. And I'll introduce you to some different groups of flies as we go. And hopefully by the end, you will come away with, even if you don't love them, maybe a greater appreciation for these important pollinators. The fly that you see on your screen now is called a ladybird fly. I just want to note that it's really cool when you see a fly that has that kind of like mimicry, or it kind of looks very similar to an insect that more people love. It's almost like, I'm going to put on this costume and make you love me. All right. So, my first reason is that I think this surprises a lot of people that when you look at all the different kinds of pollinators that we know about around the world, there are about 200,000 species that are included under that umbrella. And bees and other hymenopterans like wasps and sawflies make up a little less than half of that. Flies are right after that order, right? So more than butterflies, more than beetles, more than anything else, flies are really important, widespread, common, important pollinators. So I think, I'm from Butterfly Pavilion. I love butterflies, but I'm going to say here that if I care about pollinators, flies are actually more numerous in terms of doing that job. There are also a lot of different kinds of flies. And of course, I say this with the full understanding that there are so many flies out there that possibly we know very little about. If you look in the Colorado State Wildlife Action Plan, there are very few flies included at this time just because there aren't very many people studying them. We don't have a very strong understanding of how they're doing right now. But if you look in North America, there are about 17,000 species of flies. Not all of them are pollinators, but a lot of them are. And compare that to about 4,000 bee species. In Colorado, we have over 300 different kinds of hoverflies. That's one family of flies. And we have about 300 species of butterflies, and that's all the families of butterflies, right? So that really gives you an idea that, oh, this one family of flies almost outnumbers all the butterfly species in total here in Colorado. But we just don't know. And the thing that, in terms of diversity, is that they have different life cycles. They have different preferences in terms of where they like to be in habitat. They have different body shapes. They have different amounts of fuzziness. There's just a lot about them that surprises people. I think when people think of flies, the first thing they think about are house flies, right? And that's a fly we've all seen, we've all probably been annoyed by, but we're going to get into some of these incredible types of flies. And of course, you can't talk about pollination without, recognizing how important it is for food. And flies do indeed pollinate very many crops around the world and here in Colorado. So fruits like apples and strawberries; in the tropical world, things like mangoes and chocolate. What's pictured here is a chocolate midge. If you've ever seen a cacao tree, we do have one here at Butterfly Pavilion. It's quite small. The flowers are tiny. For the chocolate pod to be like a football size, it's pretty remarkable that it starts off as a very small flower on the trunk of the tree. And these tiny little flies called midges, who love humid areas, love a little bit of tropical forest mess, they are the ones responsible. And without them, we don't have chocolate. So I know as a chocolate lover, that would really be upsetting to me. So beyond those are like the, like overview reasons to love flies. Like there are a lot of them. They're very diverse. They have impact on our food supply. But now I'm going to get into kind of like some different kinds of flies and why you might love them here in this region of the country. So it turns out that at high altitudes, flies are some of the best pollinators we have. Part of that is that many times their bodies are a little smaller, which means that it doesn't take as much energy for them to get around. Some of that is the fact that they tend to be generalist pollinators and they can avail themselves of many different kinds of flowers. So they do fairly well at high altitude. And then they are really good at basking and soaking up heat. So they just tend to do very well at high altitude. The only negative part of that is that we're seeing that our high altitude pollinators, including flies, are some of the pollinators that are most impacted by climate change at this time. And so understanding how to preserve or how to conserve these high altitude habitats is going to be very important if we want these pollinators to stick around. So some of the high altitude pollinators that maybe you have conflicted feelings about are our horse and deer flies. Anyone who has ever been bit by them. I say cut because if you look at a horse fly or a deer fly mouth parts, they actually look like two scythes. And I've actually been in the field and come away with my collar of my shirt completely soaked with blood because I've been bitten so many times. What they do is they slice through your skin and then they use their spongy mouth parts to suck up blood. And those are females that are getting blood to be able to feed their eggs or have eggs, right? To have that protein, so for egg production. So I understand nobody likes to get bit, but these are pollinators. They are native to high altitude areas, and so they do serve that role. But there are some high altitude fly pollinators that do not have that kind of behavior. So hoverflies, which we'll get into a little bit more in another category, and dance flies, which dance flies are really cool because they're small, and they call them dance flies because the males dance to impress the ladies, which I'm always a big fan of. This is one reason to love flies that I think any of us who have gardens or grow food are really a fan of. Many flies as larvae are very good at eating aphids, other soft-bodied insects, or to lay their eggs in pests, such as various kinds of caterpillars and things like that. This family that I'm highlighting here are called the tachinidae or parasite flies. Parasite flies does not sound like something you want around you, but they are parasitoids on other insects for the most part. The way that you can tell this family apart from other families is they tend to have these big, very showy bristles on the tips of their abdomen. So I call them bristle butts. It's a very easy way to tell if you're looking at a tachinid fly. But a lot of other flies also do this service for us. So syrphid flies, or a common name for that is hoverflies. Bee flies are bombyliids, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Thick-headed flies and soldier flies all have parts of their life cycle where they are helping to manage pests in our landscaped areas. And so if pollination just isn't enough for you, then know that these animals are really important to maintaining balance of different kinds of insects in our planted spaces. Um, the other part of that, of course, is a lot of flies have an aquatic part of their life cycle. So syrphid flies are a great example. The common name for those are hoverflies. Many of them have their larvae underwater and in wetlands or in streams. Because of that, they're an important part of aquatic food chains. But something that we see in disturbed or contaminated aquatic environments is that we see impacts on these larvae. One of the things that is most disturbing to me is that in many cases, surfactants or things that are found, or other chemicals, sometimes from herbicides, will get into our waterways and actually prevent these larvae from being able to complete their life cycle. So it'll actually keep them in this weird holding pattern as larvae, and then they just eventually die. So these chemicals can have a very severe impact on these pollinators. And, somebody might say, well, they're in the water. How could that affect a pollinator? Well, it's important to know that these particular pollinators do really get impacted by our aquatic health. And so we can use that information to understand what the health is of our aquatic ecosystems that are in our areas, whether that's an urban area or a rural area. Um, they often call their larvae rat-tail maggots. So again, very attractive name, something everybody wants more of, but they are really important to those environments. The cool thing about syrphid flies, and these are probably some of the pollinating flies that are easiest to love, they look a lot like bees. And so in many cases, somebody will see them, and if they don't count the wings or look closely at the eyes, they might think that it's a bee. And they are so good at flying, they are able to hold themselves in one place and hover like a hovercraft, a lot of times right in front of your face. And and some people like try to swat them away because they think it's a bee, maybe coming close, too close to them. But they are just probably checking you out with those incredible eyes. But other flies also are important for that aquatic health component. So soldier flies and midges are also very important indicator species for aquatic health. Um, just a side note, a lot of these flies we're going to learn look like other things. And there's a good reason for that. If you think about being a fly, you don't have a stinger. You can fly really well. You can fly away, but what's a good way to try to trick a predator into not eating you? Have those yellow and black stripes, look like a bee, look like a wasp. And we'll see that repeatedly as we look at some of these flies. Here's another very popular fly, a flesh fly. Again, doesn't sound too uh, popular with the pollinator crowd. But these do, as adults, what they're looking, when we say flesh fly, they are looking for carrion and things like that to lay their eggs in. Um, and without them, we would be neck deep in carry-on, y'all. And I don't think anyone wants to live that life. So we should be very grateful that these flies are part of that nutrient cycle, breaking down dead and decaying matter and making sure that it gets returned to the soil and returned into the food web so that we can all live our lives and not be surrounded by dead stuff constantly. But as adults, not only are they looking for carrion to lay their eggs, they are looking to flowers because the nectar fuels their flight. It is pure, carbohydrates, gets them going. It's a flying fuel. The way to tell a flesh fly apart from something maybe like a housefly is they tend to be bigger. They usually have very smooth eyes. I don't know if you knew this, but a lot of flies have hairy eyes. That's kind of weird, but cool, right? But then flesh flies have three vertical lines on their thorax, and that's a pretty easy ID characteristic that you can tell that they're part of this Sarcophagidae family of flesh flies. So they are looking for carrion or dung to lay their eggs in. Other flies that help us out with returning nutrients to the food web are blowflies and soldier flies. So flies play an important role there as well. Um, I know where I live, there is some great habitat, and then there are habitats that are maybe degraded, whether it's by invasive species or just by disturbance or fragmentation. And there are many species of flies that can do fairly well in those kinds of environments. They may be some of the first pollinators that are able to move in. This particular family, they're a little small and maybe not as glamorous, but they're really important pollinators. And there's some that we find in these disturbed areas or even areas with fairly low plant diversity. These flower flies or Anthomyidae are some of the flies that we see first moving in. these particular flies, as adults, they really are dedicated pollinators. And so you'll notice, if you can see in the picture, they have bristles all over, which are great for carrying pollen. And they'll actually eat the pollen as well as drink the nectar. Um, and so we really adore them when we see them. Other flies that also can live in these disturbed habitats and show up. Um, Even in areas that aren't perfect habitat, maybe habitat where other pollinators take a little bit more time to find, are things like blowflies and flesh flies. So humans have created an environment that supports blowflies and flesh flies really well. And so many times they can move into these disturbed habitats and carry on pollination before we can actually come in and then make the habitat a little bit better for all the other pollinators. So I know we're in midsummer. I don't know about everyone else, but I'm so ready to think about fall. Fall cannot come soon enough for me. And there are some pollinators that do really well in these shoulder seasons, right? Like that early spring, that fall season when temperatures are getting cooler, when there are different plants blooming or fewer plants blooming. Um, these particular pollinators are more cold tolerant, and they're also more tolerant of those big swings of weather. As we know, here in Colorado, we can have a very, very sort of unpredictable shoulder season. So spring can veer, as we all know, from May, from 6 inches of snow to 90 degrees in hardly any time at all. And these are pollinators that can go with the flow fairly well. And they're also very good pollinators of those plants that bloom at those times. So the two families that I wanted to shout out for those shoulder season pollinators, the first one are blowflies, which again, they are some of our carry-on flies. So they will lay their eggs in rotting material. That's where they have their babies. So again, they're important in that regard, but they will visit everything from those first sumac blossoms to some of our other early spring plants. I will find them on hawthorn, um, I'm not a big fan of calorie pear, but it's everywhere. And you will find blowflies all over that because calorie pears also stink. So that might be a good accompaniment to those carry-on scented flowers that we saw a little bit earlier. Blowflies, if you love green sweat bees, maybe give these guys a look because they also look like little jewels if you give a chance to take a look. They're often bright blue, bright green. They're very shiny, very metallic. Um, and they are really good at flying, and good at getting around. And they're everywhere. So they really do, like in the spring, they're really important pollinators. As we get closer to the fall, some of my favorite pollinators are the bee flies. And this is family Bombyliidae. And they, again, another bee mimic, for those of you who are looking for more. Many of them have robust bodies. And actually, I wanted to show one of my favorite ones. This one is Cystoicus vulgaris. Which they're just like little flying pom-poms and so adorable. I saw my first one in the garden today. And so maybe that to me is a little signal that we won't be in the heat of summer forever, but I think we still have a long ways to go. Um, but many of them are parasitoids. Some of them are parasitoids on grasshoppers. So if you have a lot of grasshoppers around, you want more bee flies around. Some of them, like the bee fly that you see above, have very like dark patches on their wings. And that's another really helpful ID characteristic that you can use to identify different kinds of flies. But these love our asters, our fall blooming asters. And so if you have, whether it's tansy aster or heath aster or some of our other native asters, you are almost guaranteed to see bee flies visiting. They will also visit rabbit brush and black-eyed Susans and things like that. Those are all great plants for these late season bee flies. And then finally, I think, a lot of the reason that pollinators have become so popular, um, over the last few years is they are just really gorgeous animals. When we look at a bumblebee or a monarch butterfly, you have to accept like they are really beautiful to look at and interesting to watch. And flies are the same. So what we have here, one family, the soldier flies, the Stratiomyidae, often they're called soldier flies because back in the day, soldiers kind of dressed in snazzy little jackets. And if you look at the soldier fly that is black and yellow in the middle, he almost looks like he's wearing a snazzy little fitted jacket, like a little soldier. Um, these soldier flies, my favorite one is the Hedriodiscus, which is the bright green one that you see in the lower left. They're lime green, like 1980s neon lime green, like really, really incredible flies that love to visit many different kinds of plants. A way that you can tell them apart from other flies is instead of having their wings slightly out at rest, they actually like to fold them like folded scissors behind their backs. And what I've read is like, oh, yes, they, hold their wings scissor-like at rest. And these guys love to rest. I mean, soldier flies, you often find them just hanging out. A lot of flies, like hover flies and blowflies, you get too close, they fly off. They're very fast, very agile. Soldier flies just really, they'll just sit there a while. And so they really help amateur photographers out. So if you are a photographer, go out and find some soldier flies, get some great photos. These also have aquatic larvae. So again, really important for our aquatic ecosystems. And then you have the thick-headed flies. And the thing that's really cool about these is you can look at a flower and say, oh, that looks like a wasp. And maybe depending on how you feel about wasps, you may say like, oh, I better stay away. These are flies that look like wasps. So it's not tough enough to look like a bee. They're going to look like a thread-waisted wasp and really convince you not to be a predator on them. I think that they're so interesting to look at with that skinny little waist and those wild antenna, that fork in the middle. So crazy. But the thing that I love most about these thick-headed flies is that these are parasitoids. So they will find other insects and they will lay their eggs inside those insects. But the thing that's really cool is that they will do it sometimes in mid-flight because the female, actually her ovipositor, is capable of prying apart the segments of other insects and inserting the ovipositor inside the body. And not only that, many times their eggs are actually barbed so they can lay the eggs at the surface and the eggs will work themselves in. Like to have barbed eggs, like that's pretty badass, you have to admit. I've never heard of that with anything else, although I'm sure it happens. But anyway, they're just like interesting and they're so different. So that's an introduction to some of the flies that you might see in your own gardens or in local open spaces or parks when you're out and about. And so part of my job as a horticulture director here at Butterfly Pavilion is really thinking about not only habitat for some pollinators, but how are we really thinking about habitat for all these amazing pollinators that are out there, and yet we still have so much to learn about them. So there are certain things that we think about when we think about habitat and how we create biodiverse landscapes, even in urban areas. And some of that is thinking about, well, what resources are limiting? Is it nectar and pollen? Is it shelter and nesting? And figuring out how to add those resources to that habitat. Also thinking about all the different kinds of life cycles, whether understanding that some of these flies have aquatic larval stages, or thinking about um, where it is these flies might spend the winters or how long their life cycles are. And then finally, understanding that you need the babies in order to feed other animals and to keep life cycles going. So really highlighting how are we creating habitat that not only support the adults of these incredible animals, but really thinking about that larval stage, even if maggots sound gross to everybody. So some of the things that we think about when if you're interested in making more habitat for these amazing fly pollinators, there's some things to consider. So I think this crowd probably understands that runoff with, contaminated runoff can pose a negative impact on a lot of living things, not just flies. But that's just something that we can be aware of, whether it's talking with neighbors or talking to your local community about how can we make sure that we are avoiding polluting aquatic runoff. That's going to be really important for those hover flies and those other flies with aquatic life cycles. Also, in your garden, having a little bit of, if you have areas that are a little moister or a little bit more protected, those are likely where our terrestrial flies are going to be laying their eggs. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that might look like. But syrphid flies, for example, some of them don't lay their eggs in the water. But if you have like an old tree snag, or if you just have like an area that stays muddier a little bit longer than other parts of your landscape, that might be key habitat for those syrphid flies. Understanding that our flies, many of them emerge early, or some of them are out till quite late in the year, making sure that you have a variety of native plants, especially, we'll talk about a little bit more about specific plants, but especially plants in certain families like asters, um, ensures that you will have blooms for these adult flies when they are looking to fuel up. Um, these flies, for the most part, are not big fans of tidiness. So many of them love areas where there are, for example, leaf litter or ground covers, or making sure that there are shrubs to shade the area, things like that. Having certain areas that are a little wilder is definitely friendlier to the flies. And then, I'm never going to say, well, just live with all the house flies in your house and just put up with them. That's not really the result that I'm looking for when I talk with people about flies. I understand that there are some interactions that we don't want, but there is a lot that we can do without using poisons to um, kind of figure out how to reduce those negative interactions and promote those positive interactions. And a lot of it, honestly, is habitat modification. So thinking about like, do you have debris up against your house? That is makes it more likely for insects to join you, or even just like maybe this is a great time of the year to scope out, are there any gaps in screens, or are there any gaps in, a window well or something like that, because that's how insects find their way in. So it really is the most effective to change the habitat directly around where you live. It's just, you're not having to work trying to eradicate something that will never be eradicated. You're just managing, you can control what your experience is, and just make it more pleasant for yourself. And then a plea for any of you fellow bug nerds, if you are already involved in community science, I'm very grateful to that, because a lot of what we're learning about pollinators here in Colorado and beyond is thanks to the work of volunteers who go out and collect data, whether it's using iNaturalist or being part of a more structured program. All of this is important for us to understand what species are here, what flowers they're visiting, what is happening to them over time as climate changes. So, and it also it's a great way to learn more about these animals. The more, like, if you love to take pictures, you take pictures of flies, and all of a sudden you realize there are so many incredible flies, and other pollinators that you want to learn more about and understand more about their life cycle. So if you are a gardener and interested in adding more plants, many flies are generalists. They will visit many kinds of plants, but as I mentioned earlier, most of them have fairly short tongues and they're very sponge-like. So they tend to like small flowers clustered together so that it's efficient for foraging. So plants in the carrot family, the aster family, and to some extent the rose family are all great. candidates for adding to your fly garden and nary a stinky flower in the bunch. So you can have, asters and yarrow, in terms of natives, even things like canyon plume, the Fallujah paradoxa. I see flies going to that quite frequently. Any kind of black-eyed Susan or blanket flower or even thinking about those early season flies, I see blowflies often going to our three-leaved sumac. That's one that blooms quite early, and those blowflies will really be effective pollinators of that plant. So there are a lot of really great options that you can create a beautiful garden for our fly friends. And then really thinking about as a pollinator, having to fly around a lot. This is true not just of flies, but of most pollinators. If you're able to kind of create these clumps and layers, you are creating very efficient pollinating as well as shelter. So if a sudden storm moves in, or if a pollinator decides it wants, sees a bird and wants to hide from it, having sort of layers of perennials of different heights, grasses, shrubs, and trees, allowing some open areas and some sheltered areas. What that means is that the flies that need those sheltered, moist areas for egg laying will have a perfect spot for it. Those pollinators that lay their eggs in other insects, they are likely to find those other insects and be able to carry on their life cycles. And then I'm a big fan of allowing a little bit of mess. So if there's leaf litter, things like that, that's helping to protect the soil and making it more likely that pollinators like flies will be able to live there. And even if all you have is a tiny little um, you know, footprint where you can plant, or even if you can't plant yourself, there is a way to participate. Even the smallest amount, if more of us are doing it, it really does add up to connected habitat, to larger habitats, and to allow these pollinators, including flies, to move through the area and reproduce and expand their populations. This is something that we see at some of our locations where we work, such as pollinator districts, is that if we're putting concerted effort into creating these habitats and connecting them, we see types of pollinators increase. And that's what we want in this world where we're getting a lot of bad news about invertebrates. So understanding that most of us live in what we would call novel ecosystems, if you live in a suburb or you live in a city, we've changed the environment very much. But the good news is that these novel ecosystems can be harnessed as refuges for pollinators, especially when we're experiencing, severe drought or these wide temperature swings, things like that. In many cases, where these novel ecosystems we're creating are places where pollinators can come. Other species, even vertebrates like songbirds, can benefit from how we're managing our urban and suburban landscapes. And as a gardener, I love to be busy. I love to be in the garden, but a lot of fly pollinator support means just letting things be a little bit. And in the fall, just taking a break and letting the flies take a break, right? And so that's something I advocate for a lot. Like we don't have to garden every inch of the garden perfectly and have everything tidy, especially if we want some of these wilder pollinators. And the more that we are just watching and keeping track of what we see in our gardens, the more that we can understand just the sheer diversity of flies and other pollinators that are there. And I hope that learning a little bit about these flies help you to see them more, because when you get a visit from something like a cool bee fly, it hopefully it can make your day. And even those flies like the flesh flies and the blowflies I think are beautiful, but like things like flesh flies or flower flies, they are an important component. So when we talk about pests, just because something might look a little intimidating or unpleasant doesn't mean it's not doing something really important for us. So love the good, the bad, and the ugly. So I know these slides will be provided. There are some resources, some great field guides that will help you learn more about flies. Websites such as Bug Guide are great. iNaturalist is a huge resource. I did want to note that we have a conference devoted to native plants every year that will take place in February next year. But the Colorado Pollinator Network is a great organization partnership to get to know if you want to learn more about some of these non-traditional pollinators. So with that, I just want to thank you for being here and being willing to learn more about these flies. I don't think we should, like this poor little syrphid fly shaking in his little boots when he's confronted by bees. I think that they should stand proud and tall because they are doing important things and habitats would not be the same without them. So with that, I hope that there's some questions to answer.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was so much fun. And I know we all learned a lot. I think I'll be telling people about those barbed eggs forever. But yes, we do have some few questions that we can get to. First one, why do flies have hairy eyes?
I don't think anyone, if someone knows, I haven't been able to find it. I think there's so much about the invertebrate world that we still have to learn. It could be a sensory thing, a lot of times those bristles are part of their chemoreceptors or other kinds of sensory receptors. And it could be that if you have big eyes, that's square footage that's area that shouldn't be put to waste. So sensory receptors over everything.
Okay, nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
Our next one. Is there any guesstimate as to what percentage of invertebrate pollinators spend part of their life cycle as aquatic insects?
Oh, that's something I don't know, but that would be really helpful to know. If I think about pollinators here in Colorado, it tends to be the flies that have an aquatic portion of their lives. If you think about things like butterflies and moths, we know them as caterpillars, beetles, they spend a lot of their time in soil. So, as larvae, as grubs, many of them do. So flies are really some of the more common pollinators that we think of in terms of having an aquatic component of their life cycle. But there's so many non-pollinators, invertebrates that are so tied to water and water health. Fireflies, dragonflies, all of that. It's really important to have clean water if we want that insect diversity and all those ecosystem services.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think what you said about the chemical runoff was so important. Um, our next question, this person loves their bee flies. They're wondering with the disposable outdoor fly trap website states that their traps are designed to catch a wide range of common nuisance and filth flies, including house flies, blowflies, blue and green bottle flies, and flesh flies. How detrimental are these to our summer fly populations? That these people are considering them a nuisance and with these traps.
Right. I think so. Those traps use certain attractants that are specific to those blowflies and flesh flies, but also understanding that those blowflies and flesh flies, in many cases, are important parts of our habitat. Um, what I tell people, like even with mosquitoes, like a good fan will work wonders if you want to keep them away from you, right? Much better than having traps for because killing them isn't always the answer. Um, in terms of impact on like the state population, I really don't have a good way to estimate that because it's hard to know how many people are actually using these traps. But they are fairly targeted. I would say, like, if it were me, I wouldn't use them, obviously, but I don't think they're very widely used at this point. So I'm actually much more concerned about the use of pesticides, the habitat destruction, things like that in terms of impacts on flies.
Okay. And so more concerned about pesticides, but what do you typically say to people who come up to you who want to use the bug zappers or fly paper and the impact of those?
Yeah. Again, habitat modification is going to be your best friend. So making sure that your screens aren't breached. And I'm sort of a little bit of a hypocrite right now because my dog completely slashed my screen. He was so excited about something and he put a hole right through it. So that needs to be patched. But making sure to close up gaps, making sure that you kind of keep debris a little bit pushed away from your building, that's going to do making sure you clean up your trash, which that seems like such an obvious thing, but you'd be surprised by how many people are annoyed by flies, and it's because their trash is right there where they're trying to enjoy the outdoors. So sanitation is really important. All of that does such a better job of mitigating those negative experiences as opposed to a bug zapper is something I would absolutely not recommend because it kills everything, not just the insects that are considered pests. So, um, I get really sad when people have bug zappers and it's killing moths and things like that.
Yes, that's so good though to, yeah, talk about the modification with them.
Yeah.
Do flies need water sources to drink in your garden, or do they just drink nectar?
So our pollinating flies mostly get their water for flying around from the nectar that they drink. Where the water comes in is, again, if they have an aquatic part of their life cycle where they want to have their babies.
Okay. And another
Yeah.
question that just came in specifically about the babies, for which water structures would be best for those? Fountains, stagnant water.
Yeah. So what's actually best for many of those are going to be wetlands, right? So many of them, like our hoverflies, that have rat-tailed maggots, they love kind of muddy water, water with a lot of other living things in it, because that's what the maggots are eating. So I actually would say, um, like for your own home, provide the nectar for the adults and then advocate for your local wetlands and your local creeks and that's going to be the best way to contribute to their larval habitat. And then those flies that maybe rely on moist sites in your garden, if you have some shady spots where you can let the leaf litter just kind of stay, that's going to be providing that larval habitat for those species. I don't think anyone should probably put stagnant water in their garden, just thinking about things like, again, habitat modification and mosquitoes and things like that.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Are there invasive flies in Colorado that are less beneficial, or are all our flies native here?
There are absolutely some flies that have been introduced from other areas. I don't think any of them have risen to attention and been classified as, like on the level of like a noxious weed, but like an invasive species. Again, this is something that I simply think that a lot of people don't know very much about. Because not enough people are out there documenting what flies they're seeing. But there aren't, to my knowledge, there aren't any flies that people are actively trying to contain contain the spread here in Colorado at this time.
Okay. Um, and do flies also pollinate and frequent any fruit trees and orchards?
So, flies will go to apples, to cherries, other stone fruits. They will. I think, when you think about honeybees and how effective they are, a lot of it is because they are very condensed in a colony, right? And so they can cover a lot of an orchard, just one colony. But flies absolutely pollinate those fruits. They also pollinate strawberries. So if you grow strawberries, you actually want to see a fly visiting your strawberry flowers.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe this will be our final question. I think we've got them all otherwise, but this person wants to know, am I doing more harm than good trying to attract pollinators to my garden in the middle of the fruit farming area of Palisade, where farmers are spraying chemicals regularly?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I feel for you because I understand kind of the conflicted feelings. Um, I feel that any habitat we put in, if we're doing all we can to have a safe, biodiverse, healthy habitat for our pollinators and other wildlife, that's better than not having it at all. Um, I think always thinking about like how drift might move in, like that is a consideration if you're in the drift zone and you're concerned about those chemicals coming into your property. That's something to consider. But otherwise, a lot of the research has shown that having healthy habitats actually um, is helpful when insects are trying to bounce back from chemical exposure. So having a rich habitat is much better than not having that rich habitat. So unless you're in the direct spray zone, I would say it's worth having a garden for sure for pollinators.
Great. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. I think those are all of our questions and we
Great.
ended right on time perfectly. Thank you so much, Amy. This was just so informative and so much fun. And I'm gonna be rewatching this one. But thank you so much, Amy, and thank you so much everyone for joining. And we will see you next time. And an email will be coming with the recording and presenter slides and other things. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.